Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Ambassador, Mr. Consul General, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Baker Institute. It is my pleasure, I'm Edward Jeredjian, the founding director of the Baker Institute. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's conference on emerging U.S. climate policy, transatlantic approaches, and market harmonization. Now, this conference aims to explore U.S. and European policy responses to climate change and to analyze how future international policies may evolve. Key question. Our conference is designed to facilitate a positive exchange of ideas with our transatlantic allies on this challenging area of public policy. This event is a continuation of the discussions from the February 2008 conference, which was entitled Beyond Science, the Economics and Politics of Responding to Climate Change. A one-time chairman and CEO of Chrysler Corporation once said, "We've got to pause and ask ourselves, how much clean air do we need?" Well, I think the answer to that is evident. These days, we no longer have the luxury of losing our focus on energy issues. A rise in global average temperatures above 3 degrees centigrade could place not only our national security, but also our very global security, the planet itself, in peril. Scientists say that major reductions in world greenhouse gas emissions will be necessary to avoid significant and perhaps irreversible harm to our planet. This means that any successful response to climate change would have to be both comprehensive and global. Over the past year, the issue of climate change and greenhouse gas emissions policies has climbed to the top of the agenda in political and media circles here in the United States. The 110th Congress introduced more than 125 bills, resolutions, and amendments specifically addressing climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. I'm always worried about that number because it's like throwing a lot of quantity to something and you have to question the quality. Still, in the absence of federal legislation, many U.S. states have adopted their own individual greenhouse gas emissions policies, such as New York and California. In addition, a number of states have formed multi-state coalitions. The Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in New England has already begun auctioning of carbon emissions permits, and the Western Climate Initiative also plans to develop a market-based emissions trading system. President-elect Obama has promised to put climate change at the top of his policy agenda. He has emphasized his commitment to creating green-collar jobs, instituting carbon controls, perhaps through a cap-and-trade system, and passing into law a national renewable energy standard. The incoming administration will have the challenge of taking into account disparate state and regional programs and incorporating them, or at least harmonizing them, with new federal programs and goals, and perhaps new standards set by the European Union. Obviously, President-elect Obama faces a tough challenge. He will have to respond to the agenda of U.S. allies in Europe. He will have to bring more federal leadership to U.S. domestic climate and energy policy. And he will have to sell to the American people and Congress the importance of undertaking climate policy at a time of incredibly great economic uncertainty, to say the least. Our European allies, who are well represented here this morning, would like to see an affirmative response from United States representatives on their ideas for global climate policy. But individual countries face different domestic challenges. While France, for example, generates 80% of its electricity from nuclear power, the United States and many European countries are still large users of coal. Some European Union members face some different geopolitical challenges. Increased use of Russian natural gas may prove a climate-friendly approach, but this raises questions about the security and reliability of Europe's energy supply. As legislation moves forward in both America and Europe, we will have to be vigilant that trade protectionism does not reappear in the guise of discouraging high-carbon imports. We are in lean economic times. It is all too easy to resort to protectionism as a means, however short-sighted, of sustaining domestic industries. Last but not least, the research, development, and deployment of low-carbon energy technologies will not be successful if these are concentrated solely in the United States and Europe. The clean energy revolution may begin with us, but it certainly cannot end with us here. I would like to thank the consulates of the United Kingdom and France, Suez Energy North America, ConocoPhillips, Baker Botts LLP for their support of this conference. A generous grant from the ConocoPhillips Foundation has enabled the Baker Institute to embark upon a major project on future U.S. climate policy and energy markets. This conference is one of several programs to be organized under this new area of research. Now I am pleased to introduce our esteemed opening keynote speakers, Dr. Neil Lane, the Baker Institute Senior Fellow in Science and Technology, and His Excellency Monsieur Brice Lalonde. Both have been at the center of U.S. and European climate change policy. Dr. Lane is a university professor at Rice, a professor of physics, and the former provost of Rice University. During the Clinton administration, Dr. Lane served first as director of the National Science Foundation and then as science advisor to President Bill Clinton. Since leaving public service, he has been a leading advocate for American action to address climate change. His Excellency Brice Lalonde is a special ambassador for France in charge of climate change negotiations. Over the last decade, as an advisor to the private sector and local governments, he has implemented environment, energy, and development programs and policies in developing countries. Prior to this, he was chairman of the Roundtable on Sustainable Development at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in Paris. And from 1988 to 1992, Ambassador Lalonde served as a French Minister of the Environment. And now, our first keynote speaker, Neil Lane.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Monsieur Ambassador Lalonde, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to be here. I want to add my welcome to Rice University and to the Baker Institute. Especially want to welcome those of you who travel long distances to be here, and of course our co-organizers and our sponsors. It is especially appropriate, I think, that we today are focusing on transatlantic approaches to climate change, and we're very pleased to have as co-organizers, as the ambassador said, the Houston's British Consulate General and the General Consulate of France. So thank you both. Europe, of course, has been a leader in helping the world understand the seriousness of global warming and resultant climate change. And on the policy front, Europe has made commitments and begun to take action. I recognize that this has been a struggle and continues to be a work in progress, but Europe's leadership should not be underestimated. It has been very important. It would have been better had the U.S. been there at the table as a partner during this period, but that was not the case. We now have some catching up to do, and I hope we can do that very quickly, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. But I want to begin with a disclaimer. I'm not a climate scientist or an economist or a diplomat. I don't have the expertise in those areas. I'm a theoretical physicist who spent some time in Washington and had some involvement with climate change policy, particularly during the time I was on the White House. I have some scars and bruises from those experiences, which I'll spare you. Now I'm happily back at Rice, my academic home from the 1960s, when I became a member of the physics faculty, and of course delighted to be working with the Baker Institute in a whole broad range of policy areas related to science and technology. Under Ambassador Edward Jurigian, it is really an amazing place, as many of you know. My colleague, Dr. Kirsten Matthews, a molecular biologist and fellow of the Baker Institute, manages the Science Technology Policy Program, and we work closely with other Baker Institute scholars and fellows, including Amy Jaffe, who runs the Baker Institute's Energy Forum and who, with her staff, really put this conference together. As an example of our work together, last February, we jointly organized a one-day conference, which was entitled Beyond Science, the Economics and Politics of Responding to Climate Change. And by responding, we really meant, of course, mitigation as well as adaptation. And this is a report of the conference. It's available outside, very small charge. It's actually free. Please take a copy. I think it was a fascinating conference, and and a very nice report. So I thought might be most useful to our conference today if I tried to summarize a little bit about what went on at that February conference, and then I'll share a few personal comments along the way. One nice thing about no longer being in government is you can really say pretty much anything you like. The idea for the Beyond Science Conference came out of a discussion I had with Malcolm Gillis a couple of years ago. Malcolm Gillis is the former president of Rice University. He's an economist, and he's an economist who for a very long time has believed climate change was a serious matter that needed to be addressed. So Malcolm and I were lamenting the fact that in this country, while there were many conferences on the science of climate change, there really weren't all that many discussions of the more difficult matters in a way, the economics and policy considerations. And so we thought it might be a good idea to do something. We talked with Amy Jaffe, our colleague, who enthusiastically agreed to help put together a conference, and we were very pleased to also have the support of the Science and Innovation section of the British Consulate General. The February conference agenda was very full. I would say maybe over full. Several people complimented us at the end of the conference saying, this one-day conference was a wonderful 2.5-day conference. So we did a lot, and there's no way that I can summarize all of that. We talked about the climate science, state of climate science, the observations and the computer model projections. We talked about the likely impacts of climate change and the range of approaches that one might take to mitigate climate change, but also to adapt to climate change that's coming. We talked about the pros and cons of the cap-and-trade system, carbon tax, energy tax, and the political realities and other relevant matters. This was not a conference to debate scientific findings. We took as the basis for our conference the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 2007 report, the IPCC report. We also were not debating the fact that the U.S. needs to take a proactive role, or that this is a global problem, a major proportion. So here's an excerpt, a few words from the excerpt of the introduction that I think sets this in words. As the world's largest consumer of hydrocarbons and a leading emitter of greenhouse gases, the United States must play a key role in any global effort to combat climate change. American scientists have been at the forefront of the emerging consensus view on the human role in climate change. Yet U.S. policymakers, politicians, academics, and the media have struggled to fashion a concrete response. I might even put it more strongly than that, but that's what our report says. The scope and complexity of this issue demands an equally diverse and multidimensional response. Whatever its final form, a comprehensive strategy will require global cooperation on a scale never before achieved in history. The keynote address to our conference was given by Massachusetts Senator John Kerry. Kerry, as you know, was a Democratic candidate for president in 2004 and has been a longtime advocate for policies to reduce climate emissions. Indeed, he attended last year's Bali conference and was in Poland last week. In his address, which he titled "The Road from Bali, the Future of American Policy on Global Climate Change," Kerry stated that the threat of climate change was truly grave and significant, and he called for immediate steps to deal with it. Kerry recalled James Baker's first public address as Secretary of State in 1989, in which Jim Baker warned, quote, "Time will not make it, climate change, go away." And Kerry added, "Those words of Jim's ring truer than ever. Time has not made the problem go away. On the contrary, time has obviously accelerated the consequence of this issue." Well, let me tell you a little bit about what went on at the conference. I can just briefly list some issues and impressions. The conference took as a scientific basis, as I said, the 2007 IPCC report. In my view, the IPCC does an excellent job of describing what the data tell us about how and why the Earth has warmed in recent decades, as well as the Earth's geological past, and how those changes correlate with the atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. Of course, there's still a lot we don't know, and so a robust international research effort in climate change science should remain a very high priority. Now, those who criticize the IPCC, and it does have its critics, I think do so for at least three reasons. First, responses to political pressure representing the views of a state or a sector of the economy. Or two, so-called scientists who are paid to discount the science in print and on TV without regard for the facts. And or three, genuine scientists and engineers and thinking people who tend to be skeptical about much that they read, including published work in their own field. This is a real issue, and I think it's important that the climate science community spend a little more time, in particular, with this latter group of individuals. The IPCC climate model projections, based on the best science and a variety of economic scenarios, tell a clear story that if we continue to increase carbon dioxide, methane, and other greenhouse gases concentrations over the coming decades, there is no good news for anybody on the planet, including Texas and the very vulnerable Gulf Coast region. The IPCC, using peer-reviewed literature available at the time of their review, and remember that's kind of one of the problems with the IPCC, is a lot of work is being done and published every issue of every journal, but the IPCC has made a decision that it will make its report based on the literature that is published in peer-reviewed journals at the time they get together for their summaries. They have concluded that likely over the coming decades, the average global temperature will rise by 0.2 of a degree centigrade per decade over the next 2 decades, or 2 to 4 degrees centigrade by the end of the century. Of course, warming in some regions, especially higher latitudes, including much of the U.S. and Europe, is likely to be much greater. Sometimes people think that that kind of temperature change doesn't seem like much, and it isn't much today or yesterday or tonight here or in Denver, where it's minus 17 as we speak. That was kind of a pitch for living in Houston, you understand? But it's the whole world that's warming. So a couple of degrees is a huge thing. It means an enormous amount of captured energy that's got to go somewhere, and where it generally goes is to weather, ocean circulations, kind of things that influence people. So that's an important issue in our communication with the public. Sea level, on the basis of fairly conservative estimates, is projected to rise by, I sort of use the mid-range of the estimate, let me call it 20 inches. 20 inches. I mean, Ike would have been quite different if sea level had been 20 inches higher. But it could be a meter or more. And recent research seems to point, actually, to the higher estimates. Moreover, sea level will continue to go up for several hundred years. It takes a long time for the ocean to absorb energy, and it takes a long time for it to get rid of energy. It's a slow response medium and stores a huge amount of energy. The frightening thing is that many climate experts feel that much beyond the lower end of this warming range, which I believe we're almost certain to reach, the Earth's climate will pass a tipping point, beyond which climate change is irreversible, such things as the melting of the Greenland ice sheet, which could raise sea level by 7 meters, or the slowing, even the collapse, if you like, of the conveyor belt ocean currents, which warm the eastern seaboard here, and Europe would be kind of chilly without it as well. The consequences could be truly catastrophic for many parts of the world. There are still scientific uncertainties in these models, although they're being steadily reduced. The thing I find frightening about this is often you hear about something going on in the world, an epidemic or a potential epidemic or an asteroid is coming. And then when you talk with the scientists who are studying these issues, it relieves your mind a little bit. They say, well, wait a minute, the probability of all of you dying is small. I want it to be really small, but okay. In the case of climate change, it's the experts that scare you. They're the ones that say, oh my God, we ran that last model run or we did that last study, and it's worse than we thought it was going to be. That's the part I find scary. As the climate models improve, particularly providing regional projections and decadal timescales, cities and communities will be much better able to respond. Where the science doesn't do a very good job, in my view, is predicting impacts on ecological systems, on the agriculture, on water supply, and public health. Because in the U.S., at least, we haven't spent much money understanding those things. That's not where our research money goes. That needs to change. That's a policy issue. We also don't really have a scientific consensus on how global warming and climate change is going to affect hurricanes, or tornadoes, or for that matter. The models suggest extreme weather is going to get more extreme, and so there are some overarching conclusions. And many scientists believe hurricanes are going to become more intense, and the frequency of intense storms is going to go up. We don't know for sure yet. One of our speakers at the conference, a little bit critical of us, I guess, said, you know, you really shouldn't call the conference Beyond Science. We're not beyond science. There's still an enormous amount of science to understand and research to do. Next, we turn to the likely impact of climate change on various approaches to mitigation, which means, you know, steps we take to hold back global warming and climate change, and adaptation, responding to changes that will occur. So at the February conference, we heard the summary of a report jointly issued by the United Nations Foundation and Sigma Xi Honor Research Society. That report was called Confronting Climate Change, Avoiding the Unmanageable and Managing the Unavoidable, which is always hard for me to get right the first time. It made a number of sensible recommendations, but there were two clearly overarching messages. First, we will need adaptation as well as mitigation. The climate is changing. The only question is how fast, how much, what the impact will be. 30% more of the world is currently in drought situation than it was in 1970. Increased flooding has occurred on every continent over the past 50 years, increased flooding. The IPC has reported more than 20,000 data sets which confirm that species are starting to shift to higher elevations and higher latitudes. Even if we didn't put another molecule of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the temperature will continue to rise, and sea level will continue to rise, and the climate will continue to change, and the plants and animals are going to move or disappear in some regions. Second, there's no silver bullet approach. There is what I think John Holden at our conference called a silver shotgun approach, an integrated strategy of both mitigation and adaptation. And moreover, approaching the challenge in this way presents a host of opportunities for investment and economic growth. In order to plan a mitigation strategy, one has to realize there are 4 factors that affect carbon dioxide buildup, and carbon dioxide is our main concern. It has been increasing rapidly, and once it's up there, it stays there a long time, no matter what you do. So here are the 4 factors. They all multiply together in a nice equation that you can find if you're into that sort of thing. First, population. Well, we can limit population growth through better education, better health care, reproductive rights, and job opportunities for women. Second, economic activity, GDP per capita. Well, you could reduce this factor by just lowering the standard of living of large numbers of people, but this is not a very attractive option. 3, energy intensity of economic activity, that is, energy per GDP. Well, this factor can be reduced by making more efficient use of energy, and this is really the low-hanging fruit, I think, for the U.S., maybe some other nations as well, at least in the near term. 4, the carbon intensity of energy supply, the carbon emitted per unit of energy. Well, reducing this factor requires a shift to low-carbon energy sources and sequestering carbon. This certainly needs to be a major focus of research and development investments and regulations. In addition to moving to carbon-free energy, steps should be taken to limit concentrations of other greenhouse gases. Methane, for example. Ron Sass, you'll hear from, is an expert in that area. Just reduce natural gas flaring, for example, that gives off an enormous amount of greenhouse gases. Reforestation and reducing deforestation, and changing agricultural practices to no-till agriculture, for example. And if all else fails, and all else might very well fail, geoengineering, changing the reflection of the earth, the reflectivity of the earth, actually shielding the earth from solar radiation. Very tricky business and extraordinarily expensive, in my view. So in short, we can reduce the world's greenhouse gas concentrations by one or more of the following: having fewer people on the planet, lowering the standard of living of everybody who's living on the planet, using energy more efficiently, producing low-carbon energy, and/or manipulating the environment. We can make some choices there. On the adaptation side, the fact is, I think, that few communities and cities are prepared to protect their people from increasing floods and droughts, extreme heat waves, possibly more intense storms, a meter or more of sea level rise, and the coming resurgence and redistribution of species, several of which spread infectious diseases like West Nile virus, malaria, dengue fever. Furthermore, climate change will make it much more difficult to make progress on the UN's Millennium Goals to eradicate poverty and hunger. Adaptation strategies depend very much on regional and local issues, and 2 points are worth emphasizing. Any adaptation strategy must be based on credible projections of the climate and the sea level in a particular region, how those are going to change. 2, an assessment of how that change will affect the region, the community, and we have uncertainties in both these areas. Second, any strategy to adapt to climate change must be integrated with a larger plan of sustainability. Many adaptation measures are things we really ought to be doing anyway. Hurricane Ike recently showed us that. Adaptation can be a win-win strategy and of real value regardless of the magnitude of future climate change and sea level rise. But if those are as bad as we think they might be, early adaptation is going to protect a lot of people. Finally, we come to the third set of topics, and I'll finish with this. These are the hard ones. The issues we're making where we make not so much progress as we would like. Policy options for reducing carbon emissions, which will depend on economics and politics. We recognize in most parts of the world the U.S. is viewed as a bad guy for several reasons. First, we put 30% of the carbon up there in the first place and continue to be one of the largest emitters of greenhouse gases, second only to China, and the largest emitter per capita. U.S. has only 5% of the world's population. One point I'd like to make here is that even though the U.S. is often blamed, and the Western world in general, often blamed for putting all this carbon up there, in earlier decades, we really didn't have a clue as to the seriousness of putting all that carbon up there. So what we were doing was exercising our abilities to develop the economies and improve the lives of people and so forth. And often we, especially in this country, did it inefficiently and in a way that also produced a lot of carbon. But it wasn't that 40 years ago the United States or France or Germany or UK decided, boy, we're really going to ruin the world at everybody else's expense and so forth. I think that sometimes gets lost in the discussion. Now, Vice President Al Gore, remember Al Gore? He signed the Kyoto Protocol in 1998 on November 12th, and even though economists in the Clinton administration fought about this, and they really worried that the cost of compliance would be very large. In fact, they probably worried more than the documents actually indicated. However, the U.S. Senate in the Byrd-Hagel resolution of 1997, by a vote of 95 to 0, made clear that it would not ratify any agreement that did not include China, India, and other developing countries, or would do serious harm to the United States. Hence, President Clinton never took it to Congress for ratification. Well, few presidents would, with a 95 to 0 resolution on the books. Senator Kerry, in his remarks Beyond Science at the Beyond Science Conference, explained that the Senate resolution was supported by Democrats as a way of avoiding a stronger Senate action rejecting Kyoto outright. In the presidential campaign of 2000, George W. Bush, running against Al Gore, remember that election, took the climate change issue off the table by essentially promising to regulate greenhouse gas emissions as a pollutant if elected president. Well, after the Florida ballot fiasco and the U.S. Supreme Court decision that essentially gave the White House to G.W. Bush, he quickly did an about-face, and pretty quickly, I might add, on climate change, appeasing the Republican leadership in Congress and executives of many but not all of the major energy, by means not all, the major energy utility and auto companies. Early in his administration, President Bush announced that the U.S. would ignore the Kyoto Agreement, surprising even his EPA administrator, Christine Todd Whitman, who was busy negotiating emissions reductions in accordance, she believed, with the president's wishes. She resigned in 2003, after a little more than 2 years on the job. From that point on, the Bush administration did everything it could to dismiss the science, even manipulating science sections of government reports, and to prevent any progress on further international agreements. Indeed, the position of the Bush administration was so obviously absurd that a number of U.S. states, the ambassador mentioned California and New York in particular, and regions and cities have taken steps on their own to reduce emissions, even suing the EPA to force regulation of greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act. In a 5-4 decision, the U.S. Supreme Court found against EPA. Action, I think, will have to come from the next administration. At the February conference, we heard from a number of people involved in these state and regional efforts who described their policy processes and the pros and cons of various models. It was quite technical. Texas, the largest producer of CO2 emissions in the U.S., is also the largest producer of electricity from wind energy. So it might have a role to play here. But with regard to climate policy, Texas is, I would say, only beginning to wake up. Houston, on the other hand, and Houston's mayor, Bill White, is definitely awake and taking steps to exercise leadership in this area. We also heard from a number of economists who had different views about what emission reductions might cost. For example, the projections in the UK Stern report as well as the McKinsey report, to mention two prominent voices on this matter. The economist panels discussed the pros and cons of three approaches to reducing CO2 emissions. First, cap and trade, which is viewed as most likely to reduce emissions in a predictable way and most politically palatable here in the U.S. Two, a carbon tax, which is less predictable in terms of reducing carbon emissions and not popular with Congress, although it has the advantage of producing revenues that could be used to develop new energy technologies. Cap and trade could also be put together in such a way as to produce such revenues. Third, an energy tax, which is also less predictable in reducing emissions, but more likely to reduce energy imports, and thus has an energy security advantage. Very significant issue in this country, and I'm sure in Europe. So far, though, we're not hearing much discussion among politicians about this being a possible option. It's really hard to get a serious discussion of taxes of most any kind in our political system. It has to be more subtle. There was no agreement among our economists on the panels as to which approach was best, and it was acknowledged that some hybrid model could well result. So where do we go from here? What can we expect from the U.S. after such a long dry spell? Well, it's been a very frustrating nearly 8 years for the majority of Americans who believe that global warming and climate change threaten the world's people and all things living on the planet. Rather than comment further on a sad and embarrassing history, I'll simply say things are going to change. President-elect Obama has made clear his administration will take a much more progressive stance on climate change. At the moment, the economic crisis is front and center in policy discussions, as it should be, and as I think it is in other parts of the world. But I believe President-elect's commitment to do something about carbon emissions is quite solid. I mentioned earlier that Senator Kerry was in Poland last week as a congressional observer to the talks leading up to the post-Kyoto agreement, hopefully to be in place after the Copenhagen conference next December, I think. At last week's meeting in Poland, Kerry is reported to have told the delegates, quote, President Obama will be like night and day compared with President Bush. And he added, this is a challenge of leadership, and we have an enormous obligation to meet it. The administration and Congress are on the same page. The U.S. has to act, we must lead, and we need mandatory emissions targets. Of course, Senator Kerry can't speak for the president. He certainly can't make commitments for the president, and he does not represent the views of everyone in Congress. With that in mind, he noted China will have to commit to some kind of targets or we will not be able to ratify the agreement. I think the difference will be that the U.S. will actually come to the table with Europe and China and other nations and have serious discussions and realistic proposals to offer. President-elect Obama has emphasized we have one president at a time, so formal engagement with the Obama administration will have to wait until Inauguration Day, January 20th, when Barack Obama becomes the 44th President of the United States at 12 o'clock noon, a truly historic moment for this country. Last week, President-elect Obama met with Al Gore, and Thursday's papers reported the names of members of Obama's energy team and environmental team, some of whom I've worked with, others I know only by reputation. Steve Chu is selected to be the new Secretary of Energy. It's a stunning choice. He's a Nobel laureate who knows the science and engineering and has experience running one of the nation's foremost national laboratories, Lawrence Berkeley Lab, where he's been an advocate for developing innovative carbon-free energy and fuels, solar, advanced biomass that does not compete with food crops, for example. Chu is also a strong advocate for energy efficiency. I've known Steve Chu for 30 years. He has all the necessary knowledge, entrepreneurial spirit, and skills to truly transform the Department of Energy. I don't know for sure what Secretary Chu will do, but I feel confident he will place greater emphasis on developing a portfolio of new energy technologies, not limited to biofuels, but including them. I personally believe the U.S. needs an Apollo-type program focused on energy technologies and a national renewable standard as an incentive to markets. Nothing timid is going to meet this challenge. Carol Browner was selected by President-elect Obama to be the principal presidential advisor for energy and climate, something in the White House we call a czar. So she's our energy and climate czar. She was head of EPA under Bill Clinton. I worked with Carol Browner, greatly admire her knowledge about climate change and environmental issues more broadly, and her commitment to action. She is passionate on the environment and limiting climate change, and she is willing to go against timid naysayers, either Republicans or Democrats. And remember, she has Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who knows a lot about energy and climate change. Well, I don't have any inside information about President-elect Obama's specific plans, but his comments before and after the election, combined with the outstanding team that he's putting together, suggest the U.S. will take effective action to reduce carbon emissions, increase energy efficiency, and work with other nations to confront the problem. But it would be a mistake for anyone to assume that negotiations with the U.S. will be easy. The views expressed by the Senate 95-0 vote are still held by many, and they will have to be addressed. The serious economic crisis in the U.S. and around the world will make it harder in many ways, but that cannot be allowed to stand in the way of making real progress in the next several years. As for me, I'm very encouraged by what I see happening in the Obama transition, as I am by the continued attention to this important issue in Europe, and of course by John Kerry's comments in Poland. I think the U.S. will be back in the game, and this time as a partner. Thank you very much.
Monsieur l'Ambassadeur, Messieurs les Consuls, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for inviting me. It's an honor to be here. And I came as soon as the Poznan meeting was over, because now it's your turn. We are waiting for you. You are in the forefront. Because now most of the countries, I mean developed countries, are doing or have done their homework. And I'm very proud that 1 week ago, the Council of Head of States of Europe have agreed on the climate energy package, which, as you said, was quite a difficult struggle. But now we are happy. It's behind us. I mean, if the Parliament agrees, and I hope it's going to agree. And I would just like to talk a little, because now I'm addicted to climate change negotiations. It's an awful thing. We meet all the time. And we always assume you all the same know all about it. I mean, we can't even understand when we see somebody and we talk about these funny names with funny acronyms, and suddenly you don't understand, and we feel it's impossible. You can't understand what we're talking about. And it's true that there is a difference in different countries in how the people understand the issue. How do you feel it's important or not? In Europe, it's very important. It's a very important issue. It's absolutely central. And it is true that can sometimes bring bitter feelings with countries which do not have the same feeling of urgency. So I would just like to talk about the context in which the United States is going to work this year on its domestic legislation. You are having an international context which you must be aware of. As Neil said, there is science. And it's true that it's the first time, I think, in history we have these sort of a continuous feedback between science and politics. And it's true that the science is moving all the time, and as you said, it doesn't know everything, so it's always going on. And it's very interesting because it's most of it, it's space science. I mean, people who don't agree spending money to send satellites are wrong. It's because we can see the Earth from far away that you can see what's happening. And if you didn't send satellites, you couldn't see. I mean, you can't see the sea and the level of the sea, things like that. And the science is actually, yes, bringing bad news all the time. And it's a concern, I would say. It's a big concern because we feel like diplomats talking all the time in 190 country meetings every year, and I would say every week nearly. We feel useless because the greenhouse gases are continuously increasing. The emissions are continually increasing. And some people say we are on a path to 6 degrees Celsius increase in 2100. And what's particularly worrying is that the sinks, usually the ocean takes half of the greenhouse gases, forest takes extra. The sinks are not taking as much because they are saturated, and the ocean is getting more acid, etc., etc. So all these, the added greenhouse gases are increasing in the atmosphere, and now it's something like 2 ppm. I mean, it's going faster. Okay, let's forget that. Second, we are on an ongoing international negotiation process on which the main tracks is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which we say UNFCCC. Now, everybody in the world should know what UNFCCC means. But of course, you have other tracks. You have something which the United States invented, which is very useful. President Bush, I don't know if it's President Bush or some people say the Democrats also had that idea before. You know that 80% of greenhouse gases are emitted by 15 countries or 16 countries. So if these 16 great emitters could agree between each other, well, that would make a big help and make a big difference. So we're having these major economies meeting, that was the name of it, which are very useful. You can speak very candidly, directly from one to another and say, what are you doing? Can we find ways more pragmatic, etc., etc. And so this is just a hint that we would like the new administration to go on with that sort of format, which is very useful. So it's changed the name. We can call it the Chicago meeting, or I don't know. But I mean, we need something like that to go on. As you know all, climate change is an American discovery. That's why it's particularly funny to see that sort of discrepancy between the science and the policy. It's a man called Revel who discovered it. Revel was an oceanograph. Sorry, my English is sometimes a bit complicated with these long names. He was in California, and he discovered that carbon dioxide emissions were not all captured by the sea. So he wondered where it went, and he sent one of his students up on the Hawaii, on the volcano. And it's one of the most famous graphs in history of science. You could see the increase of CO2 concentrations with the winter and summer differences going up like that. And so Revel had a student called Al Gore in Harvard. I don't know how long ago. I mean, it's very interesting to see how it's the Americans, I mean, the American science has the most important input in the discovery of the process. So in 1992, we had that summit on planet Earth in Rio de Janeiro, I suppose some of you remember. And that was a time in history where the wall of Berlin had crumbled down. There was no more enemy in the world. And we thought, we would all reunify in the love of the planet. And so we had the Climate Change Convention on climate, Rio, which is 92. And we decided then to stabilize the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere at a level which would not be dangerous to the climate, I would say. But we didn't decide what figure. But we had a beautiful meeting. We had Fidel Castro and George Bush Sr. and everyone on the same picture. It was nice. And of course, after we had to decide of how much, the figures. And that was when things went wrong. That was the Kyoto Protocol in 1997. And the problem with the first convention is that the first convention of Rio put all the peoples of the world and the countries of the world in boxes called annexes. Very dangerous thing to do. Never do things like that anymore, because once you put people in boxes, you cannot get them out of the boxes. And why is it a problem? Because at that time, China, India, and all these countries were not so important as they are today. So they are still developing countries. And it's quite, I would say, surrealist. So I don't know if I can speak as an ambassador. There's no journalist here. But I mean, when you see in the same place, Saudi Arabia complaining, we are like Tanzania, and that sort of stuff, it's a bit peculiar, I would say. But that's one of the hard facts we have in our convention, and we have to fight and change. And in 1997, so only the countries which were listed in Rio in Annex 1, developed countries, had commitments. All the others would have commitments later. And this is the purpose of our negotiation today. The first commitment of Kyoto was from 2008, this year, to 2012. And of course, as you know, everybody ratified except the United States. So the United States is the only developed country which is outside of the Kyoto Protocol. This is a big problem for us, for legal, but we will have to pay some legal consultants, very expensive. I suppose you have enough in the United States to help us. Because the easiest thing to have a new Copenhagen Agreement next year would be to have an amendment to the Kyoto Protocol. But as the United States is not in the Kyoto Protocol, how can we have an amendment to which you would agree? And this is very complicated for us because it takes 6 months to have an amendment and things like that. But it's a real problem for us to find the structure, to find this agreement in developed with the developed countries. So Europe, the European Union is on track to meet its targets, -8% in 2012. And we've been just decided, this was the climate energy package last week, we have just decided of our next period of commitment between 2013 and 2020. Because people sometimes don't understand and think Kyoto Protocol is going to end in 2020 or 2012. No, sorry, it's not going to end. It's only the first commitment period which is finished, and after we are discussing on the second period, commitment period. And we understand it's impossible, or probably at least very difficult, because politics can have miracles. Huh? But it's difficult for the United States, as it has bashed Kyoto Protocol for a long time, to agree on something which would be the Kyoto Protocol. But nevertheless, lots of countries who have agreed, who are ratifying, who are implementing the Kyoto Protocol, would not like to let it go, because lots of the efforts, all the markets, the involvement of the markets, the experience, the cap and trade systems, all that is in the Kyoto Protocol. And if you don't use the Kyoto Protocol, you have to find a way to inventing a new agreement which would take in all what is in the Kyoto Protocol for the next agreement, which is not such an easy thing. So you have these two tracks, which is a complicated thing. Each year, all the countries of the world meet, including the United States, of course, because the United States is not in Kyoto Protocol, but it is in the Rio Convention, the Frame Convention. And now the big discussion, the big important discussion is what is going to happen with the countries which are not in Kyoto but are in Rio. What new commitments will they be ready to take? And that's very important because, of course, that's where you have China, that's where you have Brazil, South Africa, the big fives, and the next 10. I don't know. And it's a complicated process, and in which you have the United States, of course, which is not at the place where it should be, but it's there. So that's what we call the AWG LCA. Sorry to say all these things, but we decided in Bali, that was last year, to have a discussion with these two tracks, Kyoto Protocol on one side, Convention on the other side, to end up in some comprehensive agreement in Copenhagen next year. Are we going to merge the two tracks? We would love that, Europeans, to merge the two tracks. How are we going to merge? It's very difficult because some countries don't want to be mixed up with the Kyoto Protocols because they still want to say they are developing, they are very poor, they need lots of exonerations and things like that. So it's going to be very difficult. This is where we are. In Bali, we agreed on 4 building blocks. That's what the name we gave to them. One is mitigation, as Neil talked about, how do you reduce or how do you lower our emissions. One is adaptation. Well, of course, you cannot stop the climate change, as he touched upon. I mean, carbon dioxide, once it's in the atmosphere, it's there for 100 years, at least 100 years as an average. So the problem is not only what you send, the problem is also what you have sent in the past, which is still there. So that's cumulative, I would say, okay? And so you have to adapt. And one of the problems is we haven't yet agreed on the aim of our convention. Have we a goal? Have we a target? We don't even know yet, because that's going to be the most difficult thing, because developing countries do not want to agree to a target because they believe it's going to have binding consequences on each of them, the burden sharing. So for the time being, we're working, but we don't know what the aim is. And so building blocks, mitigation, adaptation, finance, because we have to pay. How are we going to finance the fight against climate change? And technology, because technology is considered, probably rightly so, to be one of the magic ways to save the planet. Of course, we always say, we in Europe, that technology is good, but we need policies to go with them, and perhaps lifestyle modifications. Very touchy problem. I think one of your vice presidents said that the American way of life is not negotiable. Depending, you know, that's one of the big problems, because when you go to in Houston and you go in San Francisco you see lots of people bicycling. You don't see them in Houston, so it's very much wider, much bigger. And there's a real question, real difficulty there. How do you want to do? I mean, you know, how do you feel it to yourself? How do you think it's possible? And all these 4 building blocks should be linked, glued into a shared vision, which is the objective. The shared vision, we haven't agreed, as I said. The shared vision, actually, now we know more and more it's going to be 2 things. One is the target for reduction, the long-term target goal. This we agree all about, but we haven't agreed it written, but we all know it's going to be that, is minus 50% in 2050. The aim is to reduce by 50% the emissions of greenhouse gases in 2050 compared to in Europe it is 1990 levels, in other countries it's 2000, Canada 2006, because we had to wait until the Prime Minister was elected, so he wouldn't agree for before, etc., etc. So the baseline is a problem, but not such a big problem. You know, we can afford some flexibility there, but the minus 50%, very important. Minus 50% for the whole world emissions, that means shared burden between developed and developing. So for developed countries, this means a reduction of at least 80% in 2050. 80%, that's exactly what President-elect Obama said. He pledged for a diminution of 80% of United States emission in 2050. That's good. So we can discuss that. But of course it means that all the others have to do something also. And the problem now we are facing is that it's very easy for a politician, sorry for them, to say, okay, in 2050 we'll reduce by 80%, but I won't be elected anymore. I won't be in office, so it's going to be to my successors. And it's very easy for a successor to say, oh, it was a silly thing to do. Sorry, in 2049, I can't do it. We couldn't do it, I'm sorry. So the problem is, are we going to agree on some intermediate steps? So that's the short-term goal, in 2020. And so we in Europe, we based our figures on the reports of IPCC. You know, there is a difference. The science gives us scenarios, statistics, probabilities. And they don't want to take our place, politicians. The politicians must take the responsibility. They have to choose in the scenarios which one they will take. And so in Europe, we have chosen the scenario which limits the increase of temperature to 2 degrees Celsius. The little islands, which are afraid of disappearing in the next decades, have chosen the 1.5 degrees Celsius increase of temperature. Some countries, Australia, is openly discussing, which is quite brave actually, with a report called the Garnot report, of 3 degrees Celsius. Sorry, we cannot do 2 degrees, too difficult, but we could perhaps look at 3 degrees Celsius. It's very important to decide, you know, because you decide the goal of your reduction commitments, I mean, your target. That means you're going to discuss immediately of adaptation. If you have a 3 degrees Celsius, you have to adapt to 3 degrees Celsius, okay? And at 3 degrees Celsius, probably all the coral reefs will have disappeared, okay? So you have to adapt. How do you do? And that's a real problem. You know, it's deciding who's going to die, who's going to live. It's a real ethical, difficult problem. And it's very difficult for politicians, because if the scientists at 8 o'clock in the morning say you should not go over 2 degrees, and the politicians at 10 o'clock in the morning, 2 hours later, say, sorry, we can't do it, it's only 3 degrees, you can see all the NGOs and everybody, scandal. So for the politicians, it's very difficult really to choose because you have that pressure from the scientists, etc., etc. That's why, for the time being, there's no decision, which is a problem for us. One of the difficulties of the negotiation, of course, is we agreed to make these efforts. We say that in 2020, the decrease in emissions should be something like 25 to 40% decrease. And our energy package in the European Union was minus 20%, but we go to 30% if there is an agreement in Copenhagen. That's the sort of a bait to have an agreement. So we are in the range of minus 25 to 40%. Some other countries, Japan, Canada has not been very serious in the late years. Shh, I shouldn't say that, but you're not going to say it. I'm not going to repeat it. And other countries think it's not going to be possible. So it's a real discussion. So there we are. The discussion is called, in the Bali roadmap, can we have comparable effort? What is a comparable effort? How can we compare the effort of countries who have different climate, different distances between cities, etc., etc.? What is a comparable effort? That's a real problem in the discussion. It can be something like the cost curve. You know, there was a very famous McKinsey cost curve where you can see the low-hanging fruits. Why aren't they done? Well, probably because you need regulation and what's more and more expensive to try to mitigate. If we do that, if the United States has its domestic legislation before Copenhagen in the year, that means you have to rush, well, you can get China on board. China will never do anything if the United States doesn't do anything. And so that's one of the problems. The United States won't do anything if China is not on board. Okay. Can we help you, we Europeans? Can we play the brokers between? I mean, you know, we could do that. We would be happy to do so. But China actually and other countries, all countries are doing things, and I would say United States also. And now you must, you know, you only had a little problem with your federal level, okay? But lots of think tanks, lots of governors, lots of states, lots of companies are helping us and very active and very present all the time. And we never doubted of the, you know, the strength of the entrepreneurship and the ingenuity, imagination of the United States. So you were always there, but you were a little not in the forefront, I would say. So if we do that, and you say all countries are doing things, but the problem is not that they are doing things, the problem is how can you acknowledge what they are doing and put that in an international deal. That's the problem. Because people are always afraid. And the big problem also is, that's something you have to understand, very difficult to say, some countries are more afraid of the convention, the future convention, than on climate change itself. Why? Because they are afraid there's going to be constraints, costs, things like that. And for the time being, they are so much used, we are all used to fossil fuels, you see. Is there something as good as oil, which is so convenient, you can put in a jerry can, it's such a density of power inside of it, etc. Really, tell me. So they're always asking for a few minutes more, 10 years more, please, and so that's how. So that's one of the main problems. And one of the main problems is also that we haven't worked enough, we haven't enough optimism. Do you know how it is in the old times when we were moving in our student years, we always were fighting for the tomorrows which would sing, we say in French, les lendemains qui chantent. They didn't always sing the lendemains. We had some disappointments, of course. But most people thought that tomorrow would be better than today. And you could accept some problems in this next generation because in the next generation it will be so much better. And so this time we haven't yet got it, you know. We haven't any nice movies about, oh, how nice it will be to live without putting carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Life will be so much better. We don't have that yet. We have always doomsday problems, catastrophe, and the sense of we're doing something good for our children. It's going to be much nicer. Come on. We don't have it yet. So that's one of our main problems. And so if we do our homework, what we are going to ask for China, India, Brazil, etc. But you must understand these countries are all different. United States, 20 tons per habitant of emissions. Europe, 10. So United States is the double of the European emission per habitant. Twice, huh? But Europe is twice China's, 5 tons per habitant. And China, twice India's. So it's very different from a country to country, from a continent to a continent. So if we agree, nevertheless, China, South Africa, other countries, we're going to ask them to deviate significantly from the baseline. That's the wording in our negotiations. They will be allowed to grow a little because they are developing. They are having economic growth and not a small economic growth, as you know. So they were wanting to decouple, as you said, Neil, the carbon intensity and the energy intensity because they're not very efficient, and they want to deviate from the baseline. We, Europeans, have asked them to deviate from 15 to 30% of the baseline, which is the first time we have figures. So they were all very shocked when they listened to us in Poznan. But I mean, you know, we have to start to say things. And they'll have to peak and after decline. And South Africa, the first, South Africa is playing a very, very good role. South Africa, for the first, they said, okay, we're going to peak in 2020 and decline after. First time they commit to something, because of course, at one moment you have to peak and it has to go down, otherwise the greenhouse gases is going to go on forever. So that's one thing very important, and you have probably flexibility which is allowed. You know, the clean development mechanism. We can allow companies to invest in third world countries in projects which are also limiting greenhouse gas, windmills and things like that. And this they could use this as credits for their own obligations in a cap and trade system in Europe or in the United States, if you agree to that, or forest certificate, because, as you know, forest is about 20% deforestation. When you cut the trees, you send the carbon dioxide of the decay in the atmosphere, and this is 20% of the greenhouse gases. It's a huge amount of. So if you stop deforestation, it's probably the easiest and the cheapest and the fastest way you could slow down the greenhouse gas the emissions. So you can have some credits, and I think all the bills prepared in the United States, they include the credits from avoided deforestation. So that's mitigation. The other big part of our discussion of the shared vision is cooperation, okay? Mitigation on one side, cooperation on the other. And cooperation is, in fact, what is interesting for the developing countries. They want more cooperation. Cooperate for what? Cooperation for diffusing a climate-friendly development. Cooperation for diffusing windmills, for energy efficiency, solar, and all these technology. For instance, we're discussing with Algeria, because there's a huge amount. There's a place called the Sahara, okay? And there's lots of solar energy in the Sahara, okay? Untapped solar. So could we build a huge solar power plants and bring the grid through the Mediterranean from Spain and Italy from one side and join the grid and have all... And Algeria is interested, of course, because Algeria is exporting gas for the time being, but at one moment they will not have any left. So if they can export solar electricity later, why not, etc., etc. So I mean, this is what it means. A huge, as you said, Apollo project, a huge major increase in technology, cooperation, and diffusion of that. And of course, finance. We know exactly, with the International Energy Agency, where the avoided tons will be in 2050 if we reduce by 50% our emissions in 2050. We know that energy efficiency will be about 40% of everything, probably more. 40% energy efficiency, buildings, transportation, production, etc., etc. So this is something very important. Of course, energy efficiency, everybody talks about it and nobody's doing it. Why? Because each time you offer, let's say you offer a family, I give you, I don't know how many dollars to insulate your house, but you can use it also to send your son to university. Well, they'll send the son to university and they won't insulate the house, okay? So there's a problem of opportunity cost and things like that, and there is an upfront investment. So you have to decide to do it, compulsory, okay? Otherwise it won't be done. So it has to be compulsory. And it's incredible the amount of things you can do by saving energy, sometimes very, very easily. I can give you a million of examples, but I mean, if you go in Europe and a retail sale, you want to buy some fridge or something like that, you have labels where you can see the efficiency of what you're going to buy. And these labels have changed completely the structure of the market. In France, for instance, we have invented a system which we don't know if it's constitutional, but for the time being, it worked. And we put a tax on gasoline cars, okay? But the tax doesn't go to the state. It goes to the people who buy efficient cars. So the people who buy gasoline, not efficient cars, are subsidizing the people who pay efficient cars. Of course, the market has completely changed, and now we don't sell any more of these four-wheel driving things, you know. Only efficient cars. So it's very important. I mean, things like that work very well. And people understand, and of course, people feel better after because they pay less, of course. So this is where we are. So now, this is to say that when the United States is going to have its own legislation, and we hope it's going to come fast. Of course, it has to be compatible as much as possible with what's happening elsewhere. It has to work together. And it's true that we're not only waiting for the United States to do its homework, but we're, as you said, waiting also for leadership. Because when we hear Governor Schwarzenegger, for instance, making his decisions, it's very important. We all rush to California to see what's happening, how we can do, how we can work together, etc. And it's incredible to understand that, I was told, I don't know if it's true, a Californian spends half as much energy as an average American. So I don't know if that's true, but... that's very impressive, and so probably that started with Jerry Brown. I mean, a long time ago, huh? But now it's going on, and he's asking for having hydrogen pumps in the highways and things like that. I mean, and so this is something very important. In Europe, this is the last thing I wanted to say. I'm a bit long, I suppose. We have decided 40%, a 20% reduction compared to 1990 between 2012 and 2020. And as I said, 30% if there is an agreement. This is a 14% compared to 2005 if we change our baseline. We have decided that in 4 very important pieces of legislation which have just been agreed. Very, very important pieces of legislation which we had to agree in first reading. This was an incredible tour de force to have this agreed in first reading with 27 states with very different very different conditions, very different energy mix, structure, etc., etc. And we feel that if we have succeeded in Europe, you can do it in the whole world, because it's a sort of a modèle réduit, a small model of the whole world. We can do it. The first directive was what we changed, what we call the European trading system. We know we have a cap and trade, and this cap and trade, from the first commitment of Kyoto, 2008-2012, was based on allocation given to industry, country by country. The European trading system applies only to industry. Small industry is not inside. It's 10,000 tons of a threshold to be in that trading system. And it covers about 50% of the emissions of Europe. And this is now, the industries which are inside of that have to reduce by 21% the emissions in 2020 in a linear path. It's hard. Linear path, and but they can bank a little from the first period, and they're not allowed to use flexibility mechanisms, except they can bank the flexibility they have been using and they have stored from the first period. And it's very difficult. It's a hard thing. It was very difficult. And the hardest part was not the commitment of 21%. The hardest part was that the allocations would be auctioned. Auction. That was the real tough discussion. Poland saying, "Oh, but I'm coal-based. How can I do it?" And I don't know, Baltic countries, oil shale, very different structure. But we agreed, and the only thing is that the auctioning, there will be some phasing in of the auctioning. It's meant to be 100% of the electricity for power in 2020, and the rest of the industry is going to be phased a bit slowly, from 20% to 100% in 2025. But I can give you all the details. It's a little complicated, with special provisions for coal countries or depending from wild fossil fuel. And you're having the issue of carbon leakage, which industries which are exposed to international competition and which are depending on fossil fuel have a special provision also. I'm not going to go into the detail because it's a little complicated. Beside this directive, this piece of legislation, you have the effort sharing, it is called. It is a 10% reduction between 2012 and 2020 for energy efficiency, transport, buildings. Each country is doing it its way, and there is stringent commitments for rich countries and less for poor countries, poorer countries. And the last one is renewables. There is a compulsory target of 20% inclusion of energy coming from renewables in 2020 in the production of energy. You have to have 20% of your energy coming from renewables in 2020. I mean, this is a very hard one too, very difficult. You have to do it, but you can also trade from one country to another. You can trade because Luxembourg is a bit small. It's going to be difficult to put windmills everywhere, so you can trade. I mean, these pieces of legislation are absolutely huge. There is some other on cars. It's very difficult, but cars have to reduce their consumption and the emissions of CO2. And there is a legislation on carbon capture and storage. As you know, carbon capture and storage could amount to 20% of the solution of the problem in 2050. That means you can have your coal companies to go on, your coal power plants to go on burning coal, as long as you capture the carbon dioxide and you put it into the earth. And we have decided to build 12 demonstration plants around the world with certain money coming from the auctioning. So that was the European decision. So now there was in Poznan lots of these young staffers from the Congress. We had long discussion. They were in all the workshops with Kerry and the others. And so we are now starting a strong cooperation between Europe and the United States, and we hope together to change the world. Thank you so much.
Well, I want to thank Ambassador Lalonde for a very excellent talk and for some very optimistic news about policies that are going to be implemented in Europe. We're going to take a short coffee break and then come back for our first panel on corporate perspectives.